Can everybody hear and see the screen?
Yes, sir.
Very good. So we can actually proceed.
Yes, we can.
So that you can proceed. And the other day we looked at an overview of endocrine system, how the different endocrine substances of the different hormones are regulated in the body. And we agreed they are mainly regulated along some 3 axes, from hypothalamus to pituitary to lower glands, and others are regulated by direct changes on the hormones that this cause secrete, or the final product that they cause is secreted. And that is detected by the gland that secretes, and it adjusts its synthesis and secretion according to blood levels. For example, when you look at calcium control or calcium metabolism, we find that levels of calcium will be detected in the parathormone, in the parathyroid gland, in some cells in parathyroid glands, and that will affect how parathyroid hormone is secreted. In the same way, even if glucose is detected at hypothalamus and regulated from hypothalamus, we also have detection of glucose levels in the liver cells. A function we call glucostatic effect, that is hepatic glucocytes or hepatic cells, and they adjust secretion of insulin, and they adjust metabolism of insulin according to the liver cells. Again, within the pancreas, we have got secretion of glucagon, somatostatin, and pancreatic peptide. And these ones also will regulate insulin activity. And therefore, that is a local regulation of paracrine regulation. So that we find there are many hormones that are regulated along the glands and along the cells where they are produced. Like when you look at control of granulosa cells secretion, granulosa cells of the adrenal cortex, that is zona glomerulosa, we find angiotensin has direct effect on these cells, and therefore effects on the renal excretion of water and sodium reabsorption have direct control. So we have many hormones that are controlled by negative feedback mechanisms and positive feedback mechanisms, not necessarily through the axes that we have talked about, which are hypothalamic, hypophyseal axis. But today, we want to go systematically and look at the control or regulation of hormones that are regulated through hypothalamic anterior pituitary and most important, of course, is growth hormone itself. Also, for growth hormone, most of the time is not stimulation, it is inhibition by the hypothalamus. Inhibition by growth hormone, inhibition hormone, which is called somatostatin. Hypothalamic somatostatin regulates growth hormone activity, which is mainly insulin activity, insular or insulin-like activity. And most of the time it is being inhibited. So that is one axis, the growth hormone axis, or what we call the somatomedins axis. Somatomedins are fragments or hormones that act like growth hormone. They mobilize amino acids into proteins. They mobilize small units into larger units, including promoting insulin action at cell membrane and insect cell. That was one axis. The other axis is ACTH, onto adrenal cortex. That is hypothalamic, hypophyseal adrenocortical axis. And this axis, through ACTH or through regulation by adrenocortical hormone, is tropic to adrenal cortex. Zona glomerulus to zona fasciculata and zona reticularis to produce cortisol or to increase activity of. And so that is one axis that you're going to spend time on. That means ACTH axis. This is for glucocorticoid, for steroid. And then the other axis, of course, is the thyroid, the thyroxine axis. That is hypothalamic hypophyseal thyroid axis, which ends up with production of thyroxine, or which is converted to T3, the bioactive thyroxine, affects folic in the cells and utilization of ATP energy in the cells. So we want to look at those different axes. Then after that, we'll talk about the two hormones of the posterior vasopressin and the, which are synthesized in hypothalamus, east from posterior. We'll mention just one or two hormones that are produced by intermediate of it. POMC, pro-opiomelanocortin, which is a very large peptide hormone, and it is usually fragmented in the peripheral. And in circulation, it is broken down to give ACTH and to give other hormones that are mainly like endorphins and enkephalins and those type of hormones or substances act on brain cells that have receptors in the brain. So when we look at all these axes for anterior pituitary, this is the representation we have. Actions of anterior pituitary, 7 main hormones, but group hormones, and that is growth hormone, ACTH, and prolactin. These are purely peptide or proteins. They do not have a glyco part, and they are produced in acidophilic cells, so that when you do polychromatic staining of the anterior pituitary, we shall see these cells which are distinctly acidophilic in staining. They stain pink like you can see. And these are the cells that produce the 3 different hormones. That means corticotropes produce ACTH. Somatotropes produce growth hormone, and lactotropes produce prolactin. However, even among these, ACTH is the cells that produce ACTH, that is the corticotropes. Sometimes will stain basophilic, sometimes will stain bluish, because there is some partial glycosylation of adrenocortex stimulating hormone, ACTH. A bit of it is glycosylated, but we still count it among the protein hormones, distinct from glycoproteins. So the other 2 types of hormones, that is the thyrotropin, that is TSH, thyrotropin stimulating hormone, or thyroid stimulating hormone, and the gonadotropins, that is follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, are synthesized in cells that stain basophilic. They'll be blue. When you stain with iodine, you stain anterior pituitary, they'll stand out as philic. And therefore, the gonadotropes, the cells of the tropins, the thyrotropes will stain blue or will stain basophilic. This is important because sometimes we do get adenomas, or hyperplasia of cells that produce the proteins. So we find that these are adenomas of acidophilic. So they will overproduce mainly prolactin, they'll overproduce ACTH, and they will also produce prolactin, or they will also produce growth hormone. And that is why it is important to recognize that we have different types of colonies in the anterior pituitary hormones. Now, there's a seventh hormone, that is the beta melanocyte stimulating hormone, or the melanocyte stimulating hormones that act on the skin, on melanocytes, and this belongs to the group of protein, to the growth hormone ACTH group. When we also look at this corticotropin hormone, the corticotropin stimulating hormone, we find that ACTH mainly mobilizes hormones that have effect on glucose metabolism and glycogen synthesis. But there is another form of this hormone, which we call the LPH, or the lipotropic hormone, the lipotropin. And this beta LPH, or lipotropic hormone, does the same thing to lipids. Whatever ACTH does to glucose mobilization, to cortisol mobilization, LPH does to free fatty acid. So that free fatty acid are polymerized to form fatty acid chains, usually for storage. So that within ACTH, we also have got another sister to ACTH, which is beta LPH, or lipotropin. They are quite different in that ACTH will have about 64 amino acids, a chain of 64 amino acids, while LPH is about 91 amino acids. So they are different structures, but you find they share the sequencing of amino acids. They are both like analog ACTH, that is ACTH and LPH. So these are the hormones of anterior pituitary, and these are the hormones that are tropic thyroid gland, tropic to adrenal cortex, tropic to the gonads. So that finally, when we talk about regulation of these hormones, thyroxine and the steroids, adrenocorticosteroids and gonadosteroids, or sex hormones, they are regulated through these intermediate glands. Now, there are many other glands in between that do not fall into these three axes. That is mainly the glands around the neck. That is the parathyroid, the parathormone that is produced by parathyroid, some small glands on the surface of the thyroid gland. And we also have production of the hormones that regulate calcium metabolism. That is, we have glucagon also, and we have got the parathormone from the C cells, and we have calcitonin also from cells on the thyroid gland. Now, these three hormones, parathormone, calcitonin, and catecalcitonin, they regulate calcium metabolism, they regulate calcium levels together with vitamin D, or the cholecalciferol. And so these ones are not necessarily under the influence of anterior pituitary, although they are sometimes affected by hypothalamic activity through autonomic nervous system, through circulation, through increased vasodilatation and increased circulation. And then below that, we have the pancreas, the endocrine pancreas, that where some 4 different hormones are produced around the pancreas, and they are all mainly for control of glucose levels and glucose metabolism. Although whatever regulates glucose metabolism also regulates metabolism of fatty acids, especially free fatty acids, fatty acid chains, and also to amino acids. So that breakdown of proteins to amino acids and also polymerization of amino acids into peptides and proteins is also regulated by the same hormones of the endocrine pancreas. Main hormone of endocrine pancreas is insulin, which you all know mobilizes glucose. That glucose enters the cells through the cell membrane by insulin facilitating at the receptors of glucose at the cell membrane so that it enters the cells. And at the same time, insulin facilitates polymerizing of glucose into glycogen for storage so that we form glycogen from glucose, process called glycogenesis. Glycogenesis is changing glucose to glycogen mainly for storage, because that is how the carbohydrates are stored for future use in energy. The opposite of glycogenesis is glycolysis. So that glycolysis is breaking down glycogen. We also use it for breaking down of glucose to form ATP, form smaller units to break down glycogen and to break down glucose. That is glycolysis of glycolysis. And it does the same thing to free fatty acids. They are broken into, fatty acid chains are broken down or metabolized to free acids and cholesterol, which can be used by the cells. At the same time, we find the same insulin also breaks down proteins into amino acids, and these amino acids are used as amino acids to give us precursors of different substances, as we shall see. Tyrosine, tryptophan, and phenylalanine are very useful in producing other substances, producing hormones like thyroxine, like catecholamines, and such other smaller hormones or smaller structure hormones. So all that is regulated by insulin. So you can actually see how important insulin is and why diabetes mellitus is such a wide range disease. It has wide effect because it controls metabolism of hydrates, metabolism of lipids, metabolism of proteins. It looks at the distribution of free small units and storage small units. Looks at levels, so it regulates the levels of glucose and levels of storage glycogen. It also regulates free fatty acids and the level of stored lipids. So what makes you obese, or what makes you fat, or what makes lays down some fat under the skin of your face or thighs so that you look smooth is a lot to do with insulin, distribution of lipids from free fatty acids stored or stored lipids. So that insulin is very important in just utilization of glucose and lowering glucose levels. And that is why you find, even when we come to other pancreatic, we come to somatostatin. Somatostatin is a statin. It inhibits, it slows down the release of insulin and action of insulin, but it is local. It is a paracrine substance. substance. It is produced in alpha cells or A cells, just next to the B cells. And it crosses to have effect on the B cells or beta cells, which produce insulin. Insulin is produced by beta cells or B cells. We used to call them beta cells of Langerhans. Now they are just called B cells of Langerhans because we don't want to use the word alpha and beta, because even in the pancreas, we have got the effects of alpha adrenergic receptor and beta adrenergic. And to distinguish that, that is why we say insulin is from B cells. Glucagon is from A cells. And then after alpha and beta, we have gamma. Sorry, it's not gamma, it's delta, alpha, beta, delta. So the delta cells produce pancreatic somatostatin, which is just like the somatostatin from hypothalamus. It inhibits growth activity, growth hormone activity. It inhibits insulin activity, in this case locally, paracrine action on B cells, production of insulin. So as sugars go up high, more somatostatin is produced, try to reduce insulin production. Sorry, the opposite. When glucose goes low, then there is a switch off of insulin production by B cells. This switch off is by somatostatin, that is D cells, delta cells. And then we have P cells that produce pancreatic peptide. Pancreatic peptide is an agonist of insulin, where we said glucagon is an inhibitor of insulin production. All these four different hormones are produced by endocrine pancreas. Remember, exocrine pancreas gives us enzymes and bile salts. That is why we look at pancreas as both exocrine pancreas with pancreatic. And we look at endocrine pancreas, releases hormones directly. So that is the important thing about the hormones or the endocrine function around the intestines and around the liver. We shall also see there are a lot of other active factors from gastrointestinal mucosa that are going to influence, say, like the hunger center, satiety center, and even the way ATP is utilized in the body. We have Y peptides and many other peptides that are produced in intestinal mucosa. We have secretin, we have CCK, cholecystokinin, which has to do with lipid metabolism. And we have many other factors or endocrine factors around the gastrointestinal mucosa. That is one of the reasons we think about a gastrointestinal type of brain or enteric brain, in that it produces its own endocrine factors, that endocrine system in the some directly through bloodstream, others through effects on the vagal nerve and glossopharyngeal nerve. So it is important to see that group, this group of hormones, this group of endocrine factors around the gastrointestinal tract. And then, of course, below that, now we have the adrenal gland itself. I've already said adrenal cortex is under the influence of ACTH, pituitary, but this is only zona fasciculata and zona reticularis. They respond to CTH, is production of cortisol and corticosterone and sex steroids, androgens. In the adrenal cortex, we also have a zona glomerulosa, the outer zone, and this zone is not under the influence of ACTH. Although we can say ACTH is theotropic glomerulosa in that it increases its blood circulation, increases its nutrition, and increases even mitosis because of zona glomerulosa. But functionally, it doesn't control the release of aldosterone, because the release of aldosterone is under the renin-angiotensin system. Talk about. The important thing about the adrenal medulla is that it's like a big ganglion. It produces catecholamines, same hormones that are produced in synthetic ganglia, but as neurotransmitters. Here, the catecholamines, the adrenaline or adrenaline dopamine are secreted into circulation as hormones. But once they go to the point of action, they use the same receptors as the neurotransmitters use in autonomic nervous system. That's the important thing about the adrenal medulla. Not regulated by anterior pituitary, regulated by circulatory system of negative, just like other hormones that are not on the pituitary axis. So from the adrenal cortex and adrenal medulla, we come down to the gonads, lowest endocrine ovaries in the lady and is in man. But all of them are synthesized in the same area, the renal bed, where in the adult, in the formed body, we find the renal bed in the abdominal cavity. And that is where ovaries and testes are also formed. That's where differentiation occurs in the embryo. But throughout the fetal life, the testes descend, go out of the body into the groin and into the scrotum, so that they can be placed somewhere in lower temperatures, because the testicular function, the testicular production of testosterone is best in lower temperatures of 32 degrees centigrade. And that is why they have to descend to the scrotum. Now, this route of descent, you're doing anatomy, I'm sure you've already done it. It's very important. The testes and into the scrotum by birth. Failure to that, we usually talk about undescended testes, hidden testes, that abdominal testes, something called crypto. Crypto means hidden, not easily seen. Crypto orchid. And orchids are testes. So that is an abnormality when the testes do not descend. However, the ovaries do not descend, they stay at that suprarenal bed, suprarenal area, and even in the adult, and still see them very close to the kidneys in the abdominal wall. So it is infrarenal area, not suprarenal. Suprarenal area has got the adrenal glands, the adrenal glands. So basically, that is how anterior pituitary regulates glands below it. That is how it regulates even liver function below it. But parallel to that, we have seen some other glands, there are some other hormones that are not under the influence of the pituitary. But they may be under effects of regulation of sympathetic system through increased or decreased blood circulation, arterial circulation through the system. So those are the 7 hormones of anterior pituitary, their structure and how they act. We shall look at each of them in terms of their actions, what they do. Most important, what stimulates their production and what inhibits production in normal life. We already said for all these hypothalamic pituitary, we have what is called circadian rhythm, many times a diurnal rhythm, so that they are produced according to the day or night. They are producing according to a cycle. It can be twice a day, it can be once a day, it can be once a month, like gonadotropin. So we have this circadian rhythm or circus rhythm. And what it does is, it is a hypothalamus adjusting secretion of hormones according to cosmic changes, according to the cosmic world, according to the atmosphere, according to the environment. So that some hormones are produced mainly during the day or light time or mornings, like cortisol, because its job is to get the body ready for stresses, to increase glucose levels, to act as anti-inflammatory, to act in many ways to maintain the blood pressures. So that cortisol is mainly secreted in the mornings and again towards the end of the afternoon. And that is very important. And you find it follows secretion of ACTH. So it is primarily hypothalamus that starts the rhythm in ACTH cortisol activity, as we shall see in diagram below, that the secretion of cortisol follows the changes on secretion of ACTH, which is regulated by hypothalamus. Again, when you look at thyroxine, it also has that rate of and rhythm, so that less is produced at night, more is produced during the day. And then we find growth hormone the same way. A lot of growth hormone is produced in the night, and very little growth hormone is produced during active part of the day when there's a lot of light. So that night, just the cycle of night, increases growth hormone. And that is proper because growth hormone is going to increase amino acid synthesis, it's going to increase the building of protein, positive nitrogen balance. And so this works best night. And you find that even gonadotropins are cyclic, not so clear in man, although they say a lot of the gonadotropins are produced towards morning and not so much in the afternoon. When you look at the females, follicle stimulating hormone, it follows a very specific cycle. It follows the moon, which is 28 days, a 28-day cycle, or 27 and a third day cycle. And that is quite regular and depends on the changes. Just like the moon is changing, the moonlight, the sunlight, so does this cycle also change. It is quite vulnerable, it's quite adaptable to changes in environment. So that if somebody who has regular menses and lives in Elbagon or Molo high altitude, they go to Malindi or Mombasa low altitude, they find their cycles change. Their cycles usually may increase. That means the time between the cycle may be short. When they were waiting 28 days, now it may come in 21 days. And the person who moves from Mombasa or Malindi to go and stay in Molo because of this big change in the height above sea level, this change in atmospheric pressures, you might find they start having very rare and very little periods. Like the menses may come after every 8 weeks instead of 4 weeks. Sometimes they almost disappear. We find this even in psychological changes, like young ladies who are in secondary school. You might find somebody only gets their menstrual periods during holidays when they are free. When they're in the stress of the semester or the term, especially third semester, the menses may just disappear. As soon as she goes for holidays, they come back. And so you must be aware that the hypothalamus tries very much to synchronize physiological function with the cosmic world, with the cosmic environment. So that circadian rhythm, Sacker's rhythm, or diurnal rhythm, common factor in hypothalamo-anterior pituitary regulation. And that is true in many of the hormones. You must remember, for prolactin, we don't need to be lactating all the time. So the most important regulator is prolactin inhibiting hormone, which is dopamine, simple amine. Prolactin stimulating hormone is not very much known, although it is would be about 31 amino acids, much like a growth hormone release hormone. And for growth hormone, it is not the stimulating hormone from hypothalamus that is important or significant. It is an inhibitor that is inhibitor of growth hormone, which is called somatostatin. And so somatostatin inhibits growth hormone most of the time. And we only have a bit of growth hormone in the night, which gives insulin-like activity. So basically, this is how hormones of anterior pituitary are regulated. And as you can see there, even the portal system, the transport system through the blood vessels is adapted so that from the area where these hormones, where these releasing hormones are secreted, they go straight into a portal system, a system that is arterial and venous. It is arteries join up and they slowly change into something like a vein, which you call a venule, and that is what enters the anterior pituitary. So that this blood is direct from hypothalamus to anterior pituitary. It doesn't have to circulate through the heart like other secretions, like other substances in the body. And this, of course, saves a lot of potential, saves a lot of concentration for the secretion, because it is secreted and transported to the local position, very near from hypothalamus. As you can see, that is the optic chiasma, para-optic area. And around there, near the arcuate area, is where a lot of these hormones are secreted from. A lot also from mammillary area, and then they cross into this portal system, and they are secreted through the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system, direct onto anterior pituitary. That's very important when we come to transport of anterior pituitary hormones. As you can see, posterior pituitary hormones are neurotransmitters. They are secreted in cells in the hypothalamus. The magnocellular units, large cells in the hypothalamus, around paraventricular nucleus or paraventricular. That is along the third window in the brain, the third ventricle. And from there, they go straight by nerves, neurotransmission, and they are secreted into the posterior pituitary. So they are not synthesized in the posterior pituitary, but they are released in the posterior pituitary. and regulation is through posterior pituitary. The same thing with oxytocin, which is mainly produced in the preoptic and paraoptic nucleus or area that is around the optic chiasma, where the two optic nerves cross. Chiasma is like cross, is a junction. So preoptic and paraoptic nuclei there, that is where oxytocin is. That used to be the distinction. We used to say that vasopressin is secreted from paraventricular area. That is V for vasopressin, V for paraventricular. And then oxytocin is O, and it used to be secreted from preoptic nucleus or preoptic area. But today we know, thank you. Today we know very well that the two areas secrete both nanopeptides. Oxytocin and vasopressin are secreted from both areas. You have different cells, these magnocellular units that secrete them. Is only much more oxytocin comes from paraoptic area and much more vasopressin comes from paraventricular area. But they all go to the posterior pituitary or the neurohypophysis. They are secreted from there. Oxytocin going to the uterine meiometrium and the ducts of mammary glands, and a bit of it to the vas deferens in the testes. And the same way, vasopressin also goes to the distal convoluted tubule and collecting that to cause water reabsorption by opening the aquaporin 2 receptors or aquaporin 2 units in these cells of the posterior of the distal convoluted, and mainly collecting. These are called the cells in that area. Though they are also large cells. So you can actually compare that, hypophysis or anterior pituitary, which is involved in secretion of chemicals into anterior pituitary, uses a vascular movement. Posterior pituitary, which is neurohypophysis, or the nerve part of the neural part of pituitary, you have secretion of nanopeptides, which are like neurotransmitters, direct from hypothalamus to posterior pituitary. And as we said, these two nanopeptides are also neurotransmitters in some areas of brain and in enteric brain, in the gastrointestinal mucosa. So basically, that is the way you would look at both anterior pituitary and posterior pituitary. Now you look at the activity. What does posterior pituitary regulate? We have said it regulates growth through growth hormone and insulin activity through growth hormone. It regulates cortisol production, and therefore all the actions we shall talk about of the cortex, cortisol, corticosterone, and steroids in the body will be regulated through this ACT. That means mobilization of glucose and also breakdown, metabolism of glycogen and glucose in energy, metabolism of lipids and free fatty acids into energy and into storage. All this happens because of ACTH and growth hormone. Then we shall see all the activities of thyroxine. That is through the thyroid gland. They are also regulated through TRH. thyroid releasing hormone, thyrotropin releasing hormone of hypothalamus, and then TRH, which is thyroid release, TRH is thyroid releasing hormone, which releases thyrotropin, or that is thyroxine stimulating hormone, TSH. So that TSH is the one that regulates actions of T3, T4, or thyroxine, where thyroxine is a storage form of thyroxine, that is T4, and T3 is the active form of thyroxine. We shall see how thyroxine is made, and therefore how we can look at thyroxine as a storage substance, and that is T4 as storage substance. Thyroxine is the one called T4, as opposed to T3, which is the bioactive thyroxine, and which is very little. So that both in tissues and in circulation and in production, T4 is about 96%, and T3 is only 4%. When you consider circulation, T4 is 98%, T3 is only 2%. And a lot of this is bound. Thyroxine is one of the highest bound. 98% circulates in bound form. It is protein bound, globulins, whereas only 2% is free form. So that free thyroxine is only 2%. That is important, especially when you consider hormone like thyroxine that has receptors in almost all the cells of the body. But it means by being highly protein bound, it is available across the whole body, but the active part is very small. And whenever it is used, more T4 is converted into T3. So T4, T3 conversion is a very important process in the tissues, in target tissues and in cells. And this is done by deiodization, removing one iodine from tetrahydrofolic acid, which is T4. So that from T4 to T3, which is called deiodinization, is very important peripherally, and that is a function of TSH. So thyrotropin stimulating hormone TSH is not only important for synthesis of thyroxine and uptake of iodine by the thyroid gland, but also conversion of T4 to T3, maintaining an equilibrium in bound thyroxine and free or bioactive thyroxine. The other pituitary gland activity is about the production of prolactin, or regulating activities of prolactin. And as we have said, prolactin is mainly important for lactopoiesis, lactogenesis, and lactation. That is milk production and milk release or milk let. And therefore, a lot of prolactin activity, just like oxytocin activity, depends on sensitization of it. Sensitization that is mainly done by cortisol, thyroxine, and other factors, including insulin. So that there's prolactin all the time, but how prolactin acts depends on sensitivity of the at the time, which is governed by other factors of the time. That is like during breastfeeding and after birth. We also saw that prolactin has effect even in males because it has effect on sperm propagation, sperm transport, together with oxytocin. They have effect on vas deferens and movement or transport through the duct of the genital transport. mechanism. And prolactin itself an inhibitory effect on follicle stimulating hormone. So it actually does affect ovulation. If there is too much prolactin, what we call hyperprolactinemia, we shall find it disturbs the menstrual cycle and ovulation capacity. So it is always important in infertility or where there's ovulation issues to check the levels of prolactin. The same way, when we have poor sperm production, oligospermia or something like that, then we also need to look at prolactin levels because it could be because of hyperprolactinemia. And here, and use substances or chemicals that are anti-prolactin, inhibit prolactin production. Substances like bromocriptine, others. We'll talk about them when we get to reproduction. Now, other pituitary hormones that we talk about, and we have already mentioned, and they also become important in regulation, especially when there are abnormalities so that their levels increase more than they should, are alpha melanostimulating hormone, beta melanostimulating hormone, the endorphins and enkephalins that are act on receptors of pain in the brain, and many other peptide hormones that are also either released by the pituitary gland or they are regulated by hormones of pituitary gland. So basically, those are the activities we'll be talking about, and we'll look at each of them when we look at the different axes. And probably the first axis we are going to look at is hypothalamus growth hormone action. What are the actions of growth hormone? And we say actions of growth hormone are facilitating activities of insulin in cells so that we have growth. We have build-up of small units to large units. We have glycogen from glucose. That is glycogenesis. Free fatty acids are put together to form fatty acid chains for growth and development. Amino acids, most important is amino acids are polymerized into peptides and proteins. And that is a function of growth hormone. So that when we are talking about repair, regeneration, and any addition of body cells, metaplasia, hyperplasia, all those, we are talking about growth hormone. And we said it acts through somatomedins, through molecules that are fragments of growth hormone, and they have the effect of growth hormone. Most of the somatomedins are produced by the liver through growth hormone stimulation. And when we think about growth hormone, we think about it facilitating insulin activity and insulin function at the cell membrane for entry of glucose. So we can summarize that is a work of growth hormone: promotion of growth, conservation of protein and nitrogen, and basically maintaining repair state in the body. Now, with growth hormone, we need to talk about stimulants. First of all, the rhythm of production. We've already said most of the growth hormone is secreted in the night after midnight or during sleep. Again, high levels of amino acids stimulate growth hormone production. Because when you have high levels of amino acids in circulation, they are inviting an agent that is going to make them be polymerized into proteins, protein synthesis. And therefore, we find probably the most sensitive stimulator of growth hormone activity is amino acid. And you find if somebody injects arginine into circulation, growth hormone levels go up. So we can actually say increased amino acid circulation or increased amino acid acidemia stimulates growth hormone. Transient increase in glucose, transient hyperglycemia will also provoke more insulin to give you, more growth hormone to give you insulin-like activity to facilitate entry of glucose into cells. What are the inhibitors of growth? Inhibitors of growth hormone are the similar hormones or substances that act like growth hormone. So the fragments of growth hormone are what we call somatomedins. So somatomedins are greatest inhibitors of growth hormone. Because when they are high, then you don't need more growth hormone because they are already mobilizing glucose. Most notable example is growth hormone factor 1, IGF-1, insulin-like growth factor 1, which sometimes you find names like cartilage growth factor or bone growth factor or bone growth factor, insulin-like growth factor 1. We have growth factor 1, we have growth factor C, we have somatomedin C. All these are blockers or inhibitors of growth hormone. Because prolonged high glucose also inhibits growth hormone. So that growth hormone is reduced during diabetes mellitus, which is not controlled. When there is prolonged hypoglycemia. Again, growth hormone is reduced or inhibited by prolonged hypoglycemia. Prolonged hypoglycemia is called starvation. So during starvation, growth hormone is reduced because we also do not have buildup of protein or buildup of organic fuel. So transient hunger or transient hypoglycemia increases growth hormone, but prolonged hypoglycemia or starvation inhibits growth hormone. So I think we'll leave it there. You look at abnormalities of growth hormone inhibitors and mobilizers. But remember, if we have too much growth hormone, we also get some pathophysiology. For example, increased growth hormone production in fetus and in the very early infancy can cause what is called gigantism, like being a giant. It's called gigantism. So gigantism is the complication, is the pathophysiology of increased growth hormone production in utero. And that is too much activity of somatotropes in anterior pituitary. Although it could still come from hypothalamic, too much production of growth hormone, stimulating hormone, or reduced somatostat. But anyway, whenever there's too much growth hormone in early time, you get gigantism. Somebody becomes big, but all organs become big, including the tongue. Hyperglossus. Now, what happens if growth hormone becomes increased in later life? Like what happens with pituitary tumors, pituitary adenomas of the acidophilic type, the ones that will produce somatotrophs. When we have got overgrowth in the adults, only extremities can grow. Only the hands, the feet, and the jaws can grow bigger. Sometimes at that time, even the liver and the tongue grow big. That is the only soft tissues that grow big. There is generally it is extremities that grow big. The word for extremity means acro. You know, acrosome is towards the end, or acro. So we call it acromegaly. That is, you have enlargement of feet, hands, and jaws because they can grow. Sometimes a little bit of increase in the skull growth. And this is also accompanied by enlargement of the tongue and enlargement of the liver. Hepatomegaly and increase in the tongue. You get is glossos. So those are the effects of increased growth hormone production, acromegaly. And in the early childhood or in fetal life, you get gigantism. And therefore, when you see those type of things, you look at the pituitary, because a lot of times the cause is pituitary adenoma, not pituitary carcinoma, because that would destroy the cells, but an adenoma because it increases the somatotroph. What about deficiency of growth hormone? If there is not enough growth hormone, what happens in fetus or in infancy? You get dwarfism. You get dwarfism. And dwarfism means small person, but of normal. When you look at the head, you look at the trunk, and you look at the limbs, they are all normal proportions. The normal human being, only that he is small. So that is dwarfism. And it is called constitutional dwarfism, in that this arises from a defect in the normal systemic growth. It's a deficiency right from the hypothalamus downwards. This is as opposed to other types of dwarfism, like what happens when we have got deficiency of thyroxine. When there's deficiency of thyroxine or there's a thyroid disorder, you get cretinism. Cretinism is also a form of dwarfism, but then you find like the head is still big. The head does not become much smaller, but the body is small. And even with that type of proportions, the tongue itself is so large that it interferes with the swallowing and it interferes with the talk, with the ability to talk. And these people also have got a big liver, and their brain is also not well developed, because you needed normal thyroxine for brain development. A normal dwarf can be very intelligent, but there's quite a few dwarfs even in university level. So it doesn't affect the brain so much, but you can't find cretins in college. They usually have got reduced brain capacity. That type of dwarfism is nutritional dwarfism. Nutritional dwarfism. And this one is just referred to as failure to thrive. Failure to thrive. You see, somebody was thriving normally as a child, but as they grow bigger, they stop gaining height, they stop gaining weight. And we have other abnormalities, including even things like rickets and others. And many times they may actually be subjects of PCM, or protein calorie malnutrition, like kwashiorkors and marasmus and others. So that we have what is called failure to thrive. And failure to thrive, again, proportions are affected. Body proportions are affected. Intelligence is also affected because the starvation also affects the nerves, the brain. So those are the three main things you would think about dwarfism or in failure to thrive. Most important is growth hormone deficiency, which is constitutional and give you dwarfism. TSH deficiency or thyroid deficiency. Sometimes it's even the thyroid gland that has problem, or iodine has problem. That gives you cretinism. And then you have just failure to thrive, which is a nutritional issue. Probably we would leave growth hormone there, and growth hormone is very important to think about, because these days you'll even find products that are somatostatins that can be used to treat some forms of growth hormone abnormality. Most important, we also have some growth hormone analogs synthesized. We have somatomedin synthesized that can be used today to improve growth, which can also be used even in healing scars, to improve healing in the scars. You use locally the growth hormone. Sometimes they are also growth hormone injections. They are also growth hormone somatostatin injections that can be injected like into your retina to reduce retinal malformations, retinal overgrowth, and other areas where you may need. So growth hormone is a real hormone that is synthesized today and that is used in treatment of growth hormone abnormalities. And it is also possible to treat obesity that comes from gigantism. It's possible to treat obesity using anti-growth hormone factors. So we leave growth hormone and we leave that axis of hypothalamo, hypophyseal growth hormone liver axis, where the main action is insulin-like activity of growth hormone. And then now we look at thyroid stimulating hormone, and the axis we are talking about here is hypothalamo, anterior pituitary, thyroid axis. We will not spend much time on this. You can read about thyroid function and iodine metabolism in your own time. What is important is the principles of production of thyroxine. Now, thyroid gland is stimulated to produce thyroxine by TRH, thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, or thyrotropin from, we said, the basophilic cells of anterior pituitary. And these ones go to affect metabolism of thyroxine from tyrosine and iodine. And TSH affects synthesis of thyroxine in 4 different ways. One, it increases production and conservation of thyroglobulin. And thyroglobulin is the framework, is the skeleton along which thyroxine is synthesized. And thyroglobulin is inside the C cells, the colloidal cells of thyroid, they are the TSH produced. So it is important that you have enough thyroglobulin, and it is important that you have enough iodine, specifically atomic iodine, inside the colloid cell. So when you bring iodine together with thyroglobulin, you make thyroxine, and we shall see how. So TSH is important in A and B, and also C in the synthesis and release of thyroxine, usually T4, in the colloidal cell. So TSH is important in the substrates that are going to make thyroxine, that is the iodine and the tyrosine, and then it's also important in producing the framework, the skeleton along which this is, or the frying pan, which is the protein, the thyroglobulin. And then even after synthesis of T3, T4, when we go into circulation and into tissues where T3 is going to be the bioactive form, TSH is very important in conversion of T4 to T3, so that bioavailability of T3 increases. And that is TSH in circulation and in the target tissue. Fourthly, TSH, just like ACTH in the adrenal cortex, is tropic to the thyroid gland. That means the growth of thyroid gland, circulation and oxygenation of thyroid gland depends on TSH. And that is why if levels of TSH go high, then the thyroid gland enlarges, something we call a goiter. For example, if there's not enough iodine, so we are not making enough thyroxine, then thyroxine at anterior pituitary is not inhibited, and we have high levels being released. And these high levels of TSH make the thyroid gland to grow big, get a goiter. The treatment of goiter is to give iodine so that there's enough TSH to inhibit enough thyroxine to inhibit TSH production in the anterior. TSH also shows some action on follicle-stimulating hormone receptors. Remember, I told you gonadotropins and TSH are glycosylated polypeptides made of two subunits, alpha, which is similar, and beta, which is specific. But because of this closeness, TSH can have effect on follicle-stimulating hormone receptors. That means when we have got abnormalities of thyroxine, when we have either hyperthyroidism or hypothyroidism, it interferes with ovulation. So we can have oligomenorrhea. We can also have polymenorrhea, like in hyperthyroidism. Oligomenorrhea means very little bleeding, menstrual bleeding, either little or rare, like every 8 weeks instead of 4 weeks. If it is too much thyroxine, we can also have polymenorrhea, too much bleeding or too frequent. So it is important to realize that hyperthyroidism and hypothyroidism are very important in infertility. So that is what I'd like you to look at as hypothalamo, hypophysio, thyroid axis. The regulation of synthesis, release, and circulation of T3, T4, and conversion of T4 to T3 in target tissue. And so once you know all that about the thyroid function, then you can answer every question about the thyroid. So that's a picture of the thyroid gland, and in the middle, very large, you can see a cell. You can see colloidal cell, the pink. And that colloidal cell is a special cell in the thyroid gland, and it collects all the iodine it can get. It also has this material called colloid, which goes through the cell membrane. It collects colloid. It collects iodine. It collects tyrosine. Sometimes tyrosine maybe from phenylalanine or tryptophan, but tyrosine is the mother molecule of thyroxine. So that we put together tyrosine with iodides, and that gives you triiodothyronine or tetraiodothyronine, that gives you thyroxine. So this is the synthesis of thyroxine in the thyroid gland stimulated by TSA, thyroid stimulated. And you can see the rich blood circulation just at the bottom of those cells. And what you can see staining very blue is iodine. So that iodine, so that thyroid, these colloid cells, they absorb a lot of iodine. They are called the chief cells of the thyroid. They absorb a lot of iodine. So that even if there's so much iodine in the arterial blood, these cells will absorb iodine 100 times more than the neighboring cell. So they have specific receptors for absorption of iodine. And even when we come to say treating cancer of thyroid with radiotherapy, we use this mechanism in that if you give radioactive iodine, a lot of it will be taken into these cells and it will concentrate radiation here in the thyroid and kill the cells, while not so much of this radioactive iodine will enter muscles or other neighboring cells. So I'll give you a break, but just before the break, I want to show you the steps of thyroxine synthesis, biosynthesis of thyroxine, so that you look at it during your break. As I have told you, 3 things are very important in the colloid cells of the thyroid, that is large cells of the thyroid. You must have this framework called the thyroglobulin. This is the long structure you see, which is a large protein. A globulin is a protein. And this works like a shelf. When you want to pack things, like if you want to pack bread or cakes, you have a large crate or a large shelf where you put them. And this is how thyroglobulin behaves. Skeleton it is now. So that even when you are finished making your bread, you take away the bread, but you leave the shelf there. Thyroglobulin is left there, even after synthesis. So how does thyroglobulin help? It starts at the top there. It first attracts and combines with tyrosine, which is from either tyrosine itself or tryptophan or phenylalanine, if you can draw the amino acid. So it attaches to one tyrosine, and then it attaches that tyrosine to an iodide molecule. You can see it has iodides lined up, and it attaches the first iodine on this molecule, and that becomes monoiodotyrosine. So you have monoiodotyrosine that goes down again, it is added a second iodine. As you can see, even from the right side, there's an iodine that is moving from the gray to the blue skeleton. So it becomes 2 iodides, 2 iodines on the tyrosine. So this is diiodotyrosine. So what the thyroglobulin is doing is making many diiodotyrosines. So you have many iodotyrosines. Now, it usually does not make triiodothyronine. It does not add a third iodine. What it does, if you look at the bottom diagram, it puts the two iodotyrosines together using the OH in the middle, where you lose the H, and then the O combines the triangle, the pentagon on the right side with the pentagon on the right side. Both of them are diiodotyrosine. So it combines two iodotyrosines to make one tetraiodothyronine, 4 iodines now. So you can actually see, you see one, you see two, and then you take all those blocks of two and put them together, and that's how you make a tetraiodothyronine or T4. So what these colloid cells do, they produce, they churn out T4s, they churn out tetraiodothyronines, not triiodothyronines. And this is for storage, so that as they circulate, they are not active. As they circulate, they are a reservoir where you will be able to get T3, triiodothyronine, for activity at the target cells. When you remove one iodine, then you make triiodotyrosine. Target cells have enzyme iodinase or tyrosine deiodinase. And that is what will be giving you T3 from T4. So in circulation, we have T4, not T3. But target cells have deiodinase, tyrosine deiodinase, give you T3 from T4 as T3 is being used. And that gives you an equilibrium of active T3 from inactive or bound T4. Because this T4 circulates bound in globulins, in protein. So it is actually, it circulates as bound form, 98% bound. This is the highest bound substance in blood, the thyroxine, 98% bound. And it is released in target cells, and there it is changed in T3, and T3 acts. Is there active T3, where it is also deionized, and finally you get your tyrosine and phenylalanine back, and you get iodine back, and the iodine now can circulate back to the colloid cells. So we shall be talking about reuptake of iodine, just like we have reuptake of catecholamines at neurotransmitters. What is not used recirculates and is used again. The same thing with iodine. Iodine that has been removed from thyroxine circulates and goes back to the thyroid, the colloid cells. So not all iodine is dietary. Some of the iodine is recovered from circulation. But this is the synthesis of thyroxine. You start with a thyroglobulin molecule or skeleton that puts together tyrosine with iodine in 2 steps. Then you get tetraiodothyronine, and that is what circulates, bound, and then it is converted to T3 outside. So I want you to go for 5 minutes and digest that, and then you come back. That is thyroid hormones. We talk about the effects of thyroxine. What does thyroxine hormone do? And its mechanism of action. And then we just mentioned parathyroid hormone and calcitonin. You go and read them, so that when we meet tomorrow, we'll be talking about the adenocortex, talking about steroids, hypophyseal adrenal cortex. So for now, I'll give you a few minutes. You go out and look at the actual actions of thyroxine, and then you look at parathyroid hormone, and that's what we'll discuss when we meet after 5 minutes. Thank you very much. In the meantime, I'm sitting here in front of the computer. You can unmute yourself and ask or comment during your break. Others are free to walk out, stretch their leg and come back. Either one leg or both, come back. But you who is not leaving, you can comment or you can ask. Hello, hola, y más que nada, yo creo que Kruger, wakili wanake. Wow, wow, wow. Umwana shoka gutomera. Mm, mm. Ah, okay. No, kila hekari. Nigia soko wewe dukira bashana wikroka. Asante, nigo kikora. Nao ni wachala ikaidan. Hello, I hope we are all back. Are we? Are we back or we have taken a long break?
We are back.
Thank you. So let's do the last part. I promise we won't take long. And if somebody were to ask you actions of thyroxine, what does thyroxine hormone do? You can actually answer in one sentence. Thyroxine is the hormone in the body that regulates basal metabolism. It regulates metabolism in the cells. So whether you are talking about using ATP for energy or ATP for hormonal and enzymic activities, you need thyroxine, especially T3, to help you to stimulate the activity. It helps you to break down ATP to give you energy, to give temperature, to give heat, so that when it is cold, it is thyroxine you need circulating in the cells to break down ATP and give you heat. That is thyroxine. Mainly does this by mobilizing insulin into cells and causing increased insulin activity. Both break down glycogen into, or rather build glucose into glycogen and mobilize glucose to enter the cells so that glucose can be used and fats can be used, free fatty acids can be used, even to produce energy. It is thyroxine that also promotes proteins to enter cells and be broken down into amino acids, for amino acids to be used for different purposes. And that is why in hyperthyroidism, when you have too much thyroxine, proteins enter cells and they are broken down into amino acids. So we lose nitrogen, we lose proteins, and somebody loses weight. So thyroxine will help you to lose weight a lot when it is too much thyroxine. When you have not enough thyroxine, like in hypothyroidism, you are likely to gain weight, you are likely to be idle because your basal metabolic rate is low and you are able to have a lot of storage fat. So you become fat, lazy, and even in the brain, there's accumulation of fat and fluids, and therefore you have slow cerebral function and slow thinking. And that is the picture of hypothyroidism. Not to mention that you have a lot of thickening of skin because of some products of protein metabolism being deposited under the skin. And that is why they end up with some edema or edema. That is, they have edema, yeah, skin, and because they also have got slowed cerebral function, it used to be described as myxedema madness. They are depressed, they are sometimes almost not talking, and so it used to be called myxedema madness because all this thickening of skin and edema of skin, edema of brain, and slow thinking. That is hypothyroidism. When somebody is hyper, they are really hyper. If somebody has hyperthyroidism, they tend to do everything quickly, rather fast, sometimes not very well coordinated, and even at rest, their muscles have tremors. For example, their hands, you'll find some tremor at rest. And that is hyperthyroidism. There's also a lot of abnormality of fat and fat store. So much that you even find they store fat under the eyelids, especially the upper eyelids. So they look like they have big eyelids that even cover the eye, the slit of the eye. Something called ptosis. They have ptosis because the eyes, eyelids are weakened. So hypothyroidism will show many different effects of poor metabolic function, both carbohydrates, fats, and lipids. Hypothyroidism will show excess use of nutrients, excess use of stored lipids and carbohydrates, even excess breakdown of proteins. That's why hyperthyroid, they will lose weight because they are breaking down a lot of their stored fats and proteins. Despite the fact that they have hyperphagia, that is overeating, there's a big appetite and getting tired quickly, and therefore they drive to eat more in hyperthyroidism. So everything in hyperthyroidism is hyper. They also increase the dissociation of oxygen from hemoglobin. That means you get more use of ATP and more use of oxygen, even in small exercise. So that even when they do an exercise that is not so much, they actually lose a lot of energy. And if you read about the role of 2,3-DPG, diphosphoglycerate, in blood and in red blood cells, its job is to be substituted for oxygen. So hemoglobin releases 2,3-DPG and binds oxygen at that level. And when it reaches the tissues where it needs to release oxygen, it releases oxygen and takes more of DPG into its binding sites. And the levels of this 2,3-DPG a lot of time depends on thyroxine. So the efficiency of use of oxygen in respiration in exercise depends a lot on thyroxine. Remember, I told you the active thyroxine is T3, T4 is mainly for storage. Every time you think about thyroxine, think about increased basal metabolic rate, increased use of ATP energy, and that is called the calorigenic one, but it also has the growth action and insulin-like action. That is, it promotes of insulin, especially in as far as breakdown of it is concerned. So that is actions of thyroxine. Let's try. The mechanism of action of thyroxine, as you can see, it stimulates hypothalamus to release more TRH, thyrotropin releasing factor, which in turn, or hormone, which in turn stimulates anterior pituitary to release TSH, and TSH stimulates thyroid gland, both to produce more thyroxine and also to convert more thyroxine in the periphery. Same time, it increases cleavage of thyroglobulin so that thyroglobulin circulates back colloid to continue synthesis of thyroxine. So that TSH does not just increase metabolism, synthesis of thyroxine and release from the thyroid gland, also increases its transformations in circulation and in target cells. So please go and read from there everything about thyroid function, everything about hypothyroidism and hyperthyroidism. And to realize the commonest source of hypothyroidism, commonest cause of hypothyroidism is lack of enough iodine in the diet. If you don't have enough iodine, then TSH will be high. Thyroid stimulating hormone will be high. because it is trying to increase thyroid function. And because it is proper to the thyroid gland will respond to the high TSH by growing bigger and bigger, so that you get goiter, you get not hyperthyroidism, get an enlarged thyroid gland, which is adenoma. Increased growth is not carcinoma. However, carcinoma of the thyroid does exist, and we use radioactive iodine to trace the thyroid enlargement and trace abnormalities of the thyroid, because we saw the uptake of thyroxine of iodine is very high. So if you give radioactive iodine, a lot of it will be taken by the thyroid, and you can just monitor that with a Geiger counter, and you see how much. But these days you can actually scan how much iodine it is taking up, especially when there is too many cells, when there is metaplasia or too much cells in the thyroid. So that is a thyroid gland. And of course, you will know about treatment. Treatment will even include, for hyperthyroidism, will even include radioiodine again, because it is absorbed into the thyroid and destroys some of the cells in the thyroid. And we said it will be absorbed 100 times more than other tissues. So it will not have a lot of side effects in other tissues, like it will have adverse effects on cancer, thyroid itself. So it is important to appreciate this high concentration of thyroid, thyroxine or iodine from circulation. Now, that was the thyroid. It is the main gland of the neck, the anterior part of the neck. And it is two lobes. There is the right lobe and the left lobe, and then there is it connects in the middle. So there are two lobes, and that is a thyroid, and it is one gland. It is one thyroid. It is from here now we start getting two glands, a right and left gland. Because if you look up there, you find we have one pituitary that has anterior and posterior, but the right and left is one gland. We have one hypothalamus, and here we have one thyroid gland, but in two lobes. After that, now the other glands we are going to talk about are right and left. So like parathyroid hormone, we have got a right parathyroid and a left parathyroid. And then you go below that, you have the adrenals. You have a right adrenal, a left adrenal. You go to gonads, we have a right ovary, left ovary, and right testis, left testis. So that is another sequence you may look at from above, that we come changing the way the glands are arranged. Of course, I have left out the glands around the intestines. That is, I have left out the pancreatic glands, because pancreatic glands are not left. After all, even the pancreas itself is much more to the right side, to the left side. That is special. That is. Now we are still looking at hypothalamo anterior pituitary axis. We finished hypothalamo anterior pituitary thyroid axis, and we shall go to hypothalamo hypophysio adrenocortical tomorrow. But for now, just before we go to that axis of steroids, let us just look at parathyroids, and then you go and read about the parathyroids. What is the main action or activity of parathyroid hormones? The parathyroid hormone has one main purpose: to maintain calcium levels in blood. It raises calcium levels in blood, and therefore it is sensitive to reduced calcium levels. Whenever calcium level goes down, this is detected by the parathyroid glands, and they produce more parathyroid hormone. And this parathormone or PTH goes into circulation and goes to bones and cartilage, mobilizes calcium into circulation. It actually dissolves calcium from bone into circulation. Now, parathyroid glands are not in the axis we talked about. They are not regulated by pituitary hormone. They are regulated by calcium levels themselves. As the calcium levels go down, parathyroid produces more parathormone. As levels go up, it inhibits parathyroid production. But as we shall see, it does not just inhibit parathyroid action, it also increases production of glucagon. Glucagon acts exactly opposite of parathormone. Instead of raising calcium in blood, it reduces calcium levels. It causes calcium to be incorporated into bone, to leave circulation and go back into bone. So parathormone wears out bone. It acts on what are called the blast cells, act on osteoblasts. Osteo is bone. Osteoblast. Blast is to remove. So it removes calcium from bone, osteoblast cells. Whereas glucagon acts on osteoclast cells. Osteoclast cause more build, cause more absorption of calcium into bone. So we can actually say parathormone weakens the bone. It does osteoporosis. It does removal of calcium from bone, whereas glucagon does the opposite. Not glucagon, sorry, calcitonin. Calcitonin. Glucagon was opposite insulin in the pancreas. In the parathyroid, we are talking about parathormone and calcitonin. Calcitonin is the one that builds up, is the one that puts them back to bone. At the same time, there are many other hormones that are involved in this calcium metabolism. Because parathormone would not be able to do that. Calcitonin will not be able to do that without the action of insulin. So insulin is necessary for this calcium metabolism and calcium movement. Secondly, the corticosteroids. The corticosteroids also support parathormone action. They also cause more bone demineralization. Is bone to be removed from bone into circulation, calcium to get back to circulation. Most notable steroid is estrogen. Estrogen also is very important in calcium laying on the bone. Calcium laying on the bone or osteoblastic is building up. Osteoblastic is what builds up. It's what brings calcium onto bone. Osteoblastic activity is promoted by calcitonin and estrogen. So that estrogen causes more buildup of bone, more calcification, more more mineralization. We call it mineralization of bone. And that is why in a young woman, the bones will be very strong because of too much mineralization, because of calcium, because of estrogen. Even if cortisol is tending to cause osteoporosis, estrogen builds up more calcium into bone. After menopause, when the woman doesn't have estrogen, ovary is not producing estrogen, one of the worst things that happen to the woman at this age is bone demineralization. They cannot maintain their calcium levels in bone. The bones are wearing out and they don't have enough calcium. That is why many of them have to depend on supplementary calcium to keep the bones intact. While others who can't maintain the levels of calcium get demineralization of bone or osteoporosis, and they get pathological fractures. Pathological fractures are fractures that result from minor injury. Somebody like you can run around and fall and even roll on the ground, and you not break a bone. You wake up and move on. But somebody who's already 50, between 50 and 60, if they just fall from stairs, they are likely to break their hip bone or their radius, the radius because of holding on ground with the hand, they are likely to get fractures. Now that is pathological fractures. So that most of them, by carrying a pail of water on a floor that has soap, they usually slip and fall down. As they fall down, they hold on to the floor with the hand and they get fracture of radius of the forebone. And that is called the Colles fracture. They get Colles fracture, which unlike in children where it is a green stick fracture, these older people, it's a real fracture. And you find that these women have Colles fracture 10 times more common than the men. Men also do get Colles fracture around that age, but not as much as women. Theirs increases by ×2, whereas the one of women increases by ×10. And as women grow older, fracture of the hip becomes almost order of the day. And that is usually the neck of Ima. So that maintenance of bone mineralization, maintenance of calcium in bones depends a lot on estrogen and cortisol. So that these are not just functions of the parahormone of the parathyroid gland, they are functions of adrenal cortex. In this case, it works together with parathormone to give what we call permissive action. And permissive action is very common with glucocorticoids. They facilitate very many other hormones at their target. So those are parathyroid glands. They are small, they are the size of a pea. If you remember a pea, the small bean, that is the size of each of the parathyroids. There are 2. So they would be like 10 grams each on the sides of the thyroid. That is on the side of the neck. Sometimes they actually are so much inside the tissue of the thyroid that you don't actually see them as different. But normally they should be very different from the thyroid gland with even their own circulation, their own arteries, the parathyroid arteries, which are branches of the thyroid artery. So those are parathyroids, calcium mobilization, and of course they affect calcium absorption in the intestines, and they also affect, parathormone stimulates calcium absorption in the intestines, and it also promotes calcium reabsorption from urine, from the renal tubules, calcium reabsorption. While calcitonin encourages loss of calcium from intestines and also excretion of calcium at the renal tubules. So calcium and calcitonin and parathormone act of each other. Sometimes calcium does not, calcitonin does not work as the whole molecule. It sometimes splits into 2. One part, which is the 1 amino acids, another one like 26 amino acids, called the calcitonin. Calcitonin is just a fragment of calcitonin, but it has the receptor site, so it acts the same as calcitonin. So both calcitonin and catacalcitonin facilitate reabsorption of calcium into the body and integration of calcium onto bone or bone mineralization. So that is the important thing about parathyroid glands. And you can see too little parathormone or insufficient parathormone will lead to bone demineralization. Sorry, will lead to extra mineralization of bone. So the bone will even look more dense than normal bone, which means you lose some of the blood circulation in the bone, and not good. So you get very hardening of the bone, which you can even see on X-ray. But too much parathormone leads to loss of bone, demineralization, and fractures, including pathological fractures. So that is parathyroid, parathormone. Go and read it. Read calcitonin, read catacalcitonin, and know what the receptors are like, the ones they work on. Most people have 4 parathyroids. That is 2 on each side of the thyroid gland, on each side of the neck. But a good number have only 2, 1 on each side. And sometimes I've told you they are right inside the thyroid tissue, so you don't see them in anatomy as organs. I've already told you the functions of parathyroid is mainly to stimulate osteoclasts to release calcium into circulation, to raise calcium levels in blood when the calcium levels are low. So it decreases secretion of calcium by the kidney, so it conserves calcium to put it in circulation. That is both from bone and from what we would have lost in the kidney, what we would have lost in the intestines, all reabsorbed so that we get more calcium. It does that even by activating vitamin D, cholecalciferol, because vitamin D also conserves calcium. It helps calcium not be lost from the body and helps to increase calcium levels in circulation. And this, it works together with parathormone. Parathormone activates vitamin D to even cause intestinal absorption of calcium. That is calcium ions, the plus plus. It has opposite effects on calcium as calcitonin. So calcitonin lowers calcium levels in circulation, but increases calcium density in bone, while parathormone does the opposite. So we've already talked about a lot about calcitonin. I'll not talk about it now. It is the opposite of parathormone. It is secreted by parafollicular cells or the C cells of the thyroid, chief cells of the thyroid. And it inhibits osteoclasts so that we don't lose calcium from bone, stimulates osteoblasts so that we lay more calcium on bone. And these actions lower blood calcium. So whereas parathormone increases blood calcium, calcitonin lowers blood calcium. And the only other thing you should look at with that calcitonin is catacalcitonin. Just a fragment of calcitonin, but it has the same action of calcitonin because it attaches to the same receptors. So now for tomorrow, exactly 11 o'clock or 5 to 11, we shall be talking about the adrenal cortex, mainly actions of ACTH and cortisol, which represents actions of steroids. So tonight, please go and read the hypothalamus is your adrenal cortical axis, and mainly the actions of adrenal cortex. What does adrenal cortex do? Being a glucocorticoid and therefore raising levels of glucose in circulation, just like parathormone raises levels of calcium in circulation. And read this model of synthesis of steroids, especially synthesis of cortisol in adrenal cortex, so that you don't have to discuss it much tomorrow. You'll be understanding it, that we start from cholesterol, and from the right side, we go completely to the left by making 17 alpha progesterone, and that gives us androgens. And from androgens, we can now go down again and make estrogen. The other way is on that left side to go completely down by making 3 beta hydrogenase action on the progesterone, and then it goes right down to give us the mineralocorticoid that is synthesized in the granulosa cells of the adrenal cortex. And that gives you the difference, that when you go completely down, vertically down, you get aldosterone. When you go across halfway to 17 alpha progesterone and then come down, you make cortisol. Cortisol is from zona fasciculata and a bit from zona reticularis. So there are 3 directions I want you to look at in this steroid synthesis. One, and the most important, is the one from cholesterol to progesterone, and then you go across the left, 17-hydroxyprogesterone. That is the way you either make androgens to the right, or you make cortisol by going down. And the other way now was make aldosterone by going vertically down, cholesterol, progesterone, and then down to aldosterone. We shall see a lot of this is because of the difference, because of some 2 enzymes that are different in these 2 different zones. So that when we talk about the top, the making of androgens and cortisol, we are talking about 17 alpha hydroxylase. We are talking about progesterone hydroxylation, an enzyme 17 alpha hydroxylase. When we come down to make aldosterone, the main thing is we have a dehydrogenase for DOCA. Corticosterone, we have a dehydrogenase. That dehydrogenase is the one that takes us down to aldosterone. Because zona glomerulosa has this dehydrogenase, but does not have 17 alpha hydroxylase. In the same way, zona fascicularis has 17 alpha hydroxylase. It does not have this 21 dehydrogenase. So it is a difference between the concentration of enzymes, the different enzymes, that gives us the direction we are going to go, different enzyme systems. Otherwise, the whole of this is the steroid synthesis in both adrenal cortex and in the gonads, so that we have the same system in the gonads, only that the enzymes that are taking us to the extreme right and then down to produce testosterone and estrogen are much more in the gonads and not in the adrenal. Whereas the others on this side that make cortisol and aldosterone are more in the adrenal cortex and in gonads. For example, we have 21 and 11 hydroxylases that them in the 3rd line down. that hydroxylate 17 alpha progesterone, change it to cortisol. So you can see it is the same system for all the steroids. Those start with cholesterol, but they end up with different enzymes, different products depending on the cells we are talking about. Whether we are talking about the cells of fasciculata, the cells of the glomerulosa, or the cells of the gonads, the testes, and the ovary. So tomorrow we'll look at this axis, hypothalamo-hypophyseal adrenocortical axis. We'll look at steroids, synthesis of steroids, and actions of steroids. Please go and read actions of steroids tonight, especially glucocorticoids, and also estrogen and testosterone. It is very important you read their activities so that we also see when you have deficiency, what disorder do we get. When you have excess of any of these hormones, what disorder, how do we correct it? Thank you very much. And now you may leave, but I'll leave the forum open. If somebody wants to comment, unmute yourself and comment or ask, but otherwise you are free to. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much for your patience. I don't know if you were asleep or if you had just turned off the microphone. But if you are awake and you are there,
We are awake.
you can turn on. Thank you very much. At least you, I know you are awake because you fear I could call you by name. Anyway, thank you very much for the concentration. Please go and read everything about anterior pituitary, how it regulates the other glands, and mainly the thyroid function, adrenocortical function, and the gonadal function. And also read the growth hormone independently. See what are the disorders of excess secretion of growth hormone and disorders of deficiency of growth hormone. So we meet tomorrow. Otherwise, tonight you have a good night and make sure you rest well.